Hello, this is Roger Capello bringing you My Week at the Club, episode number 19, I believe it is, where I show you the action from the Fitchburg Chess Club in Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. That is, this week I played a game against Jim Hankard. It was the fourth round of the tournament at Ernest E. Fandreyer Memorial, and we were on board number 2, I believe. And I had the black pieces against Jim, who played white. I've played Jim before in one of these videos, so I won't go into more detail than that. He opened up with d4. I responded knight to f6, which is the standard reply. Bishop f4, his second move, is showing that he wants to go into the London system, which has got an early development of the dark squared bishop outside of a pawn triangle. And it's kind of a tough system for black in that it's not terribly ambitious. And so if black wants to have dynamic play, somehow it's going to be, the onus will be on black to actually create that dynamic play. So I immediately tried to counterattack his center with c5. That's considered a good response to the white's second move. He defended with the pawn, and I played d5. That's also a reasonable thing to do. There are other possibilities, such as queen to b6 over here. Queen to b6, sorry, there we go. And of course, the queen on that square will attack the undefended pawn, but white has things that they can do in that position as well. So anyhow, I chose to go ahead and just develop in the center rather than counterattack on the flank in this game. And he continued on with this triangle setup of pawns, which is very solid. It's, in fact, after my next move here, knight to c6, if you look at it, it really looks quite a bit like a queen's gambit declined with colors reversed and a Slav defense. And it's kind of a tough nut to crack. And actually, if black is overambitious, then white can get a counterattack out of it by sort of using this skeleton of pawns and eventually playing f4 and launching an attack on the king side. But that would be a ways into the game, and we didn't get that far. Bishop to d6, so Jim, or d3 rather, Jim is grabbing the light square diagonal here before I'm able to develop my bishop out to that square. And I'd like to get my bishop outside of my pawn chain. And at some point I'm going to play, some point pretty soon, I want to play e6, but I don't really want to trap this bishop in here stuck on its home square. So what I did was to play it out to g4, attacking the queen, which looks a little funny. Basically, it's looks like I'm pinning a knight, but there's no knight to pin. And certainly an option for him here would be to, say, go ahead and advance the pawn and drive my bishop away. I was okay with this because it does entail a weakening of his king side, makes his pawn structure a little less flexible, and this knight now that's on g1 would, barring the pawns quickly moving out of the way, would have to develop through e2. So it's, it would be a trade-off. I lose little time moving again, but he also has his development disrupted if he does this. He chose not to do that. Instead, he played knight to f3. So he went into a self-pin, basically. And it's not a terribly deadly pin, so it's not an unreasonable move to make in this case, I think. I continued on. Now that my bishop is outside the pawn chain, I played e6, supporting my center and also defending this pawn. The pawn wasn't really in danger of being lost, even though, let's say, one move ago, like in this position here, the pawn's not defended. But if white were to take the pawn, I can simply develop my e-pawn and recapture with the bishop. Or he could try to, we could get into a fairly messy situation where he could try to hold it with the b-pawn. But that would be, so let's see, go back here a little bit. He has to respond to that. And okay, doesn't really have time in this sequence. But a move earlier before I played my bishop out here, if he had, say, chased it away with the f-pawn and my bishop retreated to h5, which is likely, at this point he would then have been able to take the pawn, but it's not clear that he can hold on to it, because I could attack it easily enough with e6, and now if he tries to defend that pawn, usually this is a problem with in these sorts of structures with these two pawn moves. In this case, though, I do have a knight that could be attacked, so it's not clear. If I played an immediate a5, he could probably play b5, and I don't like the looks of this. So let's see what's happening with the engine. Well, the engine's still happy with black's position here. Playing knight a7 and making the argument that these pawns are weak, I guess, that they're a little over advanced. After knight e2, then this c pawn is going to drop, and then at some point this b pawn is also weak here on b5. You know, so maybe that wouldn't have been such a good idea for him after all. But I was willing to go into those lines where I played against this, against white trying to hold on to the c pawn, just because black gets such dynamic play. Even if it's not, even in those variations where black doesn't have an advantage, black still has fun playing against that pawn structure. Okay, so back to the game. I attacked the queen. He developed the knight into a pin, and I went ahead with my development. He played his knight to e2, or d2 rather. It's one of the disadvantages. Oops, sorry, let's turn this off. One of the disadvantages of developing of this pawn triangle is that this sort of natural square of c3 is no longer available for the knight, and the knight has to be developed through d2. But that's a typical thing for the London, and it supports a possible pawn push at some point if he chooses to try to get e4 in, which looks like quite a plausible move. So at this point I wanted to develop this bishop that's on f8, not that, this f8, not e7. I wanted to develop the bishop on f8, but the problem is if I develop my bishop, then he can, so immediately if I play, I don't know, either bishop to e7 or d6, it doesn't matter. Jim could then capture on c5, and my bishop would have to move again to take it back. So I lose a tempo in the deal. I've been putting off capturing that pawn. This happens as white in the Queen's Gambit accepted quite a bit, where you want to regain the pawn, but you want to do it in as economical fashion as possible without losing the tempo. And so you make other moves until you're absolutely forced to move the bishop, and then black, it's white in this case, with black in the Queen's Gambit accepted, would then capture and cause you to recapture at that point. I did have one more move available, or arguably there are other moves I suppose I could have made, like I could have played rook c8 in this position, but he can castle, and I'm going to run out of moves, and eventually I'm going to have to do something about this pawn before I develop my bishop. So that's why I traded the pawn. He recaptured with the e-pawn, which leads to an interesting pawn structure. You see this a lot, either like this or with colors reversed. And it's interesting because white, in this case, gets a half-open e-file to play with, an important file in the center. Black gets the half-open c-file, which is maybe not quite as important, but still a half-open file. But what also happens in these positions is that black continues on with a minority attack, where he pushes the b pawn to b5 and b4, possibly, well, ideally, I should say, preparing that with rook on the b file. Now, unfortunately, in this example with the in the London system, that bishop on f4 is controlling this b8 square here. And so it makes it a little harder for me to launch a minority attack unless I do something about that bishop that's on f4. For that reason, I decided to neutralize the bishop on that diagonal and to offer the exchange, which I would have been happy with. Instead, he moved the bishop to pin my knight. Now, I was not too keen on losing so much control over the e4 square because now that this knight is pinned, this square has been weakened, although I do still have my d-pawn holding it. There start to be some tactical possibilities. For that reason, I went ahead and broke the pin with my bishop to e7. So basically what's happened here is that I've moved my bishop to e7, taking 2 moves. So I went to d6 and then back. Oops, I didn't. That's bad drawing of the arrows. So at first I went from f8 to d6 and then back to e7. And in the process, White also made a move from with his bishop from f4 to g5. So it really only cost me 1 tempo, and I got the bishop off of that diagonal. And if he returned the bishop to that original diagonal on his next move here, so it's White to move, and that's a possibility, then he would have taken 2 moves, and I would have gotten my bishop developed for free, basically. And I could continue on castling, and at some point, maybe playing, or maybe even before I castle, play bishop to d6 and follow it up with queen c7, and if he comes back threatening to trade off this knight, let him do it, and argue that I'm getting play along the open g file. But we didn't go down that line. So instead, after bishop to e7, he attacked my bishop on g4, put the question to it. It's a reasonable move, but it's also his knight was not in serious difficulty. I think the main reason that he was eager to exert some control over my bishop is that at some point I might be threatening to do something on the e5 square, because this knight is attacking it, and I could push the pawn, and after pawn takes pawn, knight takes, be ganging up on this pinned knight. But that knight is very strong. It has the other knight supporting it. So he drove my bishop away, to a square where in a moment's notice now he could play g4 and absolutely drive it away. And then played queen to b3. So that sort of tips his hand. That's part of the reason why he wanted to weaken my influence over the f3 square, is that his queen would no longer be there to also influence it. But in reality, now there's no longer a pin either. So it's this knight is free to travel on f3. And so playing that pawn to chase my bishop away, it's kind of being long-winded about this, but was probably not totally necessary. I went ahead and defended my b-pawn since it was under attack by his queen, and this develops my queen to this diagonal now keeping his bishop from returning to it. Although he would have the possibility at some point of advancing the g-pawn here to g3, and then that would support the bishop. The downside of that, of course, is that weakens his king's position. After I played queen to c7, he played rook to c1, putting the rook on the same file as my queen. There's nothing happening immediately, but it's potentially risky. Now, right away, I started thinking thoughts of, knight taking on d4, because this pawn would be pinned with the rook back behind it. Unfortunately, as of right now, this pawn on d4 is defended not only by the c pawn, it's also defended by this knight that remains on f3. So that's not a tactical possibility. Instead, I just went ahead and castled at this point. And he castled. And now I decided to redeploy my knight. That it wasn't doing much where it was at that point, and I wanted to get it onto a on the stronger d6 square, and also do something about that pesky bishop that's sitting on g5. So I played knight e8. Okay, his response to that was to just go ahead and develop his rook to e1, which is a reasonable move. And I traded. So at this point, I looked at the position and tried to figure out how I could do something to make my pieces a bit more active. And I went into a line that is probably reasonable. It's certainly no worse for black, where I trade off the bishop and entice his knight to come to a square where it's not defended. Oh, let's put the queen back where it was. So as of right now, this knight is not defended. This knight here is on d2 is not defended, and the bishop on d3 is not defended. So there are all these nice elements of potential combinations. And so I followed up with queen to f4, which attacks those two undefended knights. Now, they're easy enough to defend by moving either one of the knights to g3. That would support the other knight, but if he and actually that's what he does. But the thing I had to worry about in this position, and I was a bit concerned, but it looked interesting, was that he might choose not to move one of the knights, but instead go in for a tactical sequence by taking my undefended pawn on b7. And after he does that, now this knight I have on c6 is no longer defended, and my rook is not defended because this knight over here on e8 is blocking my other rook from defending it. My rooks are no longer joined, which is one of the downsides of that knight to e8 move. So this rook and knight are both undefended, and my bishop over here is not defended, but that's really doesn't enter into the position. And a logical sequence in this position would have been for me to move my rook to attack the queen. I don't really want to give up the exchange at this point. His queen would then take my knight, and then I would take the D knight instead of the G knight. The reason being that now this undefended bishop is also under attack, and he would have to do something about that. The possibility is for him to continue on with the knight to take on h7. This is actually the computer's line, and threatening to take my rook on f8. And I'm going to take his bishop on d3, but before I do, there's a little Zwischenzug here, which is a nice little subtlety, which is to go ahead with the rook and take the pawn and get on the 7th rank, or 2nd rank, my 7th rank, threatening a sequence leading to mate here. Taking on f2 and then mating on g2. And that would force white to make a defensive move to play his rook over to defend the pawn. And then you take the bishop. So you make use of the queen while it's still on the 2nd rank to put the rook into a more passive position, and then take the bishop. And then to continue on, white would take the rook, and the line, and I take back with the king. And the sequence stops here, but it's actually, there could be even a little more activity because he could check the king at this point, and the king has to move away, and he could come up here and attack the knight. And now the knight, how does it get defended? If this pawn got pushed to defend it with the bishop, then unfortunately this pawn would fall a check. That's not very good. Really the only good way to defend it. Well, I could play the king back to f8, but that would just be a repetition of the position. And I don't want to draw at this point. The only real way to defend it is to play my queen back, and now that allows his rook to get out of this defensive position. So, I mean, this position is a little better for black, but it's only like a half a pawn or so. It's no big deal. The material is bishop and knight, 2 minor pieces against a rook and pawn on white's side. And so even though the numbers add up, it's tends to be a little better for black because the 2 pieces give you more potential activity. Okay, so let's move along here. So he didn't go for that. He instead played the knight back after I attacked the 2 knights with the queen. I then went along with my plan to develop my knight through d6, eyeing both of these important squares here in the center. And he retreated his queen to put a double attack on my h7 pawn. I can't block that with g6, obviously, because then my bishop would be trapped. That would be a very bad move. Although, well, no, it would be bad, although there is some weakness now on the king side as a result, but I still wouldn't want to go in for that. If you look at it, yeah, 3/4 of a pawn or a full pawn advantage for white, so it's about what you would expect. Instead, what I did was to block with the bishop along that diagonal. And Jim traded the bishops off, giving my pawns some slight weakening, but it was worth it to release the pressure against my king side. And then he was able to play his knight into e5. And now, if I were to try to chase that knight away with my f pawn, now thanks to the weakening of my pawn structure over here, this pawn on g6 would fall. So that's one of the downsides of offering that exchange of bishops. So what I did was to instead develop my other knight through f5 and put it on a more aggressive position. There's sort of three good things about this move. One is just that the knight in general is over on the closer to the king side where the queen is, and it starts to develop some possible attacking ideas against the king. It puts more pressure on this d4 square, which is pretty well defended right now, but I'm starting to get a lot of pressure, and at some point I might be able to do something, possibly in a conjunction with a rook on c8. And finally, maybe most importantly, was that the knight is controlling this e3 square so that the rook can play up to e3 and over, driving my queen away and also attacking my king side. So it's controlling that square. So it's doing a number of good things. As I pointed out in the notes, actually back here after knight e5, Jim offered a draw, and one of several draws, and I wasn't interested at this point. The position's about the same as we started out as far as advantage goes, and so there's still a lot of chess to be played. So he supported his knight on e5 with the other knight, and I continued on by putting my rook on c8, getting it on the same file as his queen now, and starting to threaten such things as taking the d-pawn with the knight. So he moved his queen. I mean, it's true the d-pawn is defended by his knight, but I've got it attacked by 2 knights now. So if knight takes pawn, pawn takes knight, well, you can't play pawn takes knight. So if, well, let's see, let's make a pass move or something. Say he makes a silly move like a3. I could go ahead and take the pawn, he takes back, and then I take his knight, and now he can't recapture because of rook takes queen. Would be a rather serious blow to white. So that's obviously something he has to do with something about, he played the queen to d2 to get it off that file. And this is forcing me to trade the queens. There's nowhere for my queen to go. And fortunately, this is saving me from my better nature, because if I had a square to retreat my queen, even if it were less active than it currently is, I probably would have done that just to keep the queens on the board and stay further away from a drawing possibility. Instead, I don't have that choice. So I have to trade off the queens, and as you'll see, that works out okay. I then took his knight And the reason for this is that I was, first of all, getting rid of that strong knight on e5 at a time when his other knight couldn't recapture. And it turns out that there's a little that he can't recapture with the rook on e5, which looks like the natural move. So if you want to pause your video and spend a few seconds looking at it, or if you already see it, you can figure out, solve that little puzzle as to why the rook can't capture the knight on e5. Okay, so if he captures the knight on e5, which is actually what he did do, then I'm just able to take the pawn on d4. The reason for that, of course, is that this c-pawn is pinned because its rook on c1 is not defended. Okay, so Jim played his rook to e1, and let's see if I can do this without, yes, without showing the move. So he played rook to e1, and now there's an interesting little combination, another combination for black, which you can pause your video if you want and see if you can find a combination that will net some more material for black against white. Okay, so the move is to play f6. And if you play f6, all of a sudden this rook now has nowhere to go along the fifth rank. And so it has to come back along the file. Can't come to e4 because of this pawn. If it comes to e2, I immediately win the exchange. So the only place he could go to would be e3 to try not to lose the exchange. But then I can simply play my knight into c2, still winning the exchange. So because of that, since the loss of the exchange can't be avoided, what Jim played in this move, in this position, was to take my knight with his pawn. So I just capture the rook, and now he took with the rook on e5. This, I imagine, looks like it's more active, but it allows black a lot of counter activity. So then I'm able to come in with a check. The best move here is to drop the knight back, even though it pins the knight. Instead, he played his king to h2, which allowed me to gather up the f2 pawn with tempo and attack this knight. And he has to do something about the knight. Now, what I expected was that he'd play the knight to b3, and that would be the best move. Instead, he played his knight to f3. And okay, and that allows me to put a double attack on the g-pawn with my two rooks, and things are getting very serious now. And if you want to pause the video and see if you can figure out how best to defend that g-pawn, you can go ahead and do it. Okay, well, the best way to do it is not to do what Jim did, which was rook g5, because that simply allows rook takes knight because the pawn is pinned. So that was another threat in this position, was that not only is the g-pawn under attack, but so is this knight here. And the best move actually is to drop back the knight to attack the rook and also defend the pawn at the same time. That's not a great move because black can continue on munching pawns on the second rank, but it's better than losing the knight. Okay, so after rook g5, I went and took the knight. He took the g-pawn. I renewed the threat against g2. And realistically, at this point, white could resign. Jim started pushing the h-pawn, though, trying to stir up a little activity against my king with this pinned g-pawn that I have. But I just went ahead and gathered pawns. Now, there's actually this is an interesting point. If he had another thing that he could do in this position, would have been to take this e pawn. And of course, I would have been happy if he'd taken the e pawn. There's a mate in 16. I won't claim to have seen the mate in 16. That was the computer that laid out the whole mate in 16. But I did see the basic idea behind the mate in 16. And it's a typical maneuver that's worth knowing when you have pigs on the 7th, as my friend used to like to call 2 rooks on the 7th rank. They can just gobble away on that rank. So you check the king, it goes to the corner. You check it again, it comes out. You check it again, it comes out further. Now, of course, it'd be a bad mistake to play rook to h1 because the other rook would be undefended and you'd lose a rook that way. So you can't do that sort of thing. But what you can do is gobble the next pawn on the rank, and now we're threatening checkmate on h1. So white has to do something about that. He comes back to not to allow that. Now, if black played rook to b1, then the other rook would be lost, obviously. So the way to continue on here then is to play rook to b2, check again, chase the king out, then you go take the other pawn. And the king comes over. And now here's kind of a nice move in this position, is to just play the rook to the e file, the other rook. The idea is that if you play the rook, the tempting thing would be to play the rook all the way, say, to b2 and to threaten checkmate with one of the rooks. But then it's white's move, and he can just play back to the first rank, and the checkmate's not going to happen. It's still a very nice position for black, but it doesn't lead to checkmate. But instead, if you play the rook to the e file, white has no choice but to trade off the rooks. Otherwise, well, you either take his rook or you checkmate him on e1. So, and then that eventually leads to checkmate. I won't go through the rest of that sequence. So, back to the game. He pushed the h pawn. I just took the b pawn. He pushed the h pawn again. I took the a pawn. He pushed the h pawn again. And now's the time for a simple little combination to lead to a totally one king and pawn endgame. You just take the pawn on g2, and with check. And if he ignores it, you just take the rook on g6. He has to take. I take back. He takes with the king, and then I play pawn takes pawn. And now this is the point where white should resign the game. There are 5 pawns to 1, and in particular, what could happen and what did happen is that black can push the a pawn and the h pawn, and white can't stop them both, and at least one of them will queen. In the game, they both queened, and I just checkmated in with 2 queens. I'm not sure why he played it out for another 15 moves, just to, I don't know, use up more of the clock or something. But, it doesn't take more than 30 seconds to play the black side of this game. It's very simple. And so I won't bore you with what actually happened, except in hyper speed here. So it ended up in a checkmate. Okay, well, that was a successful game against the London, and I'm glad London system has given me a few problems in the past, like a game I had against Tony Cicilline. So I'm always glad when I notch one up against the London system, and hopefully I'll be even more prepared the next time. So long for now. Talk to you next week, bringing you the action from the chess club in Fitchburg. Bye-bye.